On a lonely Montana road, just before sunset, a former Marine stopped his truck when his German Shepherd suddenly froze. The dog stared at an old blue van ahead, ears up, body tense, like he saw something no human eye could catch. Then it happened. Two small faces appeared behind the dusty rear window, a boy and a girl, dirty, trembling, and holding a tiny cardboard sign with one shaking word: help. In that single moment, everything changed. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing our community from around the world. And if you enjoy stories of courage and kindness, please subscribe. It truly means the world to me. Thank you, and may God bless you. The late afternoon sun hung low over the wide Montana horizon, casting long golden streaks across miles of open land. The wind that swept through the valley carried dust and the dry scent of sagebrush, whispering against the faded highway that stretched endlessly through the countryside. The distant mountains, tinted a soft lavender under the waning light, stood like towering guardians of a land both beautiful and unforgiving. It was the kind of quiet, rural scenery older Americans knew well, a place where summers were scorching, winters were merciless, and the silence felt deep enough to swallow a man's thoughts whole. Jack Miller drove along that lonely road, the tires of his old forest green pickup humming steadily beneath him. Jack was 45, tall and broad-shouldered from years of military conditioning, a man whose posture still carried the straight-backed discipline of the Marine Corps. His square jaw was marked by a few faint scars, souvenirs from deployments he rarely spoke about, and his neatly trimmed beard carried strands of gray that blended into his weathered, sun-browned skin. Jack's eyes were a deep, thoughtful blue, eyes that might have once belonged to a man full of confidence, now softened by the weight of memories. After leaving the service, Jack had retreated to the quieter outskirts of Montana, hoping the silence would help him rebuild himself, piece by piece. Beside him sat Ranger, his loyal German Shepherd of 7 years. Ranger was a large, muscular dog with a coat of deep sable and tan, intelligent amber eyes, and ears that stood alert at even the faintest sound. Time had placed a few silver hairs along his muzzle, but his movements remained sharp, trained, and precise. Ranger had accompanied Jack since his final year in the Marines during search and rescue operations, and although retired from active duty, the dog's instincts never dulled. Ranger was gentle with children and strangers, fiercely protective of Jack, and carried an uncanny ability to sense emotions, an ability that helped Jack through countless restless nights when old memories clawed their way back. The road today was nearly empty, save for a rusty brown delivery truck traveling ahead of them. The vehicle looked old enough to have lived several lives, the paint peeling, the bumper slightly crooked, dust clinging to every corner. Jack barely paid attention at first, letting the truck drift in and out of his field of vision like any other traveler heading somewhere far away. His mind was elsewhere, drifting between the slow rhythm of the engine and the melancholy peace of the open plains. Ranger, however, snapped out of his relaxed posture without warning. The dog straightened, ears rotating forward like radar dishes locking onto a signal. A soft, uneasy rumble vibrated in his chest. Jack glanced down briefly. "Easy, boy," he murmured, assuming Ranger had heard the clattering engine of the truck or smelled something unusual, but Ranger didn't settle. His body leaned forward, amber eyes fixed sharply on the rear of the truck. Jack's attention sharpened. Ranger was not the type to alert without cause. Years of surviving dangerous missions together had taught Jack to trust the dog's instincts more than his own. He narrowed his gaze, focusing on the truck as they approached a slight bend in the road. Through the dirt-streaked rear glass, something faint moved, something small. Jack blinked, leaned slightly forward, trying to catch the shadow again. Then he saw it. A tiny hand pressed weakly against the filthy rear window. Jack's breath caught. The hand slid downward before reappearing, trembling. And then a boy's face, came into view for only a second. He looked about 10 years old, his dark brown hair messy, cheeks smudged with dust, and eyes wide with fear. He wore a faded yellow shirt that looked torn near the sleeve. Behind him, pressed close for comfort, was a younger girl, maybe 7, with tangled sandy blonde hair and pale skin streaked with dried tears. She wore a green shirt, also torn, and her small fingers clutched the hem of her brother's sleeve. The boy lifted something, a piece of torn cardboard. The letters scratched onto it were messy, uneven, written by a trembling hand, but readable. Help. The girl's eyes followed Jack's truck as if begging silently. Her lips moved, shaping words he couldn't hear, but her expression said everything. Ranger let out a sharp, urgent bark, the kind he only used during emergencies. His entire body leaned toward the windshield, urging Jack to understand what both of them were seeing. Jack's heartbeat quickened. He was not law enforcement. He had no authority to pull anyone over, no weapon to defend himself, no badge to justify intervention. But Jack Miller had once sworn an oath to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. And even though he no longer wore the uniform, the sense of duty still lived inside him, quiet but fierce. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the truck. The children disappeared from view as the vehicle bounced along the uneven road, but the image of their terrified faces burned itself into Jack's mind. Ranger barked again, more urgently this time, pacing anxiously on the seat. The dog's instincts screamed that those children were in danger. Jack inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of a choice pressing onto his chest. He knew the easiest thing would be to keep driving, pretend he saw nothing, and let authorities handle it whenever they eventually stumbled upon it. But Jack had lived long enough to know that sometimes help came too late. And 2 frightened children on a lonely Montana road? That was an image far too painful to ignore. Jack reached for his phone with one hand, dialing 911 with steady, practiced movements learned from years of crisis. "This is Jack Miller," he said when the dispatcher answered. "I'm on Route 19, 20 miles west of Red Willow. I believe 2 children are in distress inside a brown delivery truck ahead of me." He provided what details he could while keeping his gaze locked on the moving truck. The dispatcher confirmed officers were en route, but the nearest unit was still several minutes away. Jack exhaled slowly. Several minutes. Anything could happen in several minutes. He leaned back in his seat, eyes narrowing with grim determination. "Ranger," he said quietly, glancing at the dog, "we're staying with them." Ranger's tail gave a single firm thump of acknowledgement, his body tense and ready. The road ahead curved into the deeper parts of the countryside, the truck picking up speed as if the driver sensed something. Jack's instincts warned him that whatever lay ahead would not be simple. But right now, 2 children needed someone, anyone, to notice them. And Jack Miller refused to be the man who pretended he hadn't seen a cry for help on an empty Montana road. The truck continued moving steadily along the fading Montana highway, but Jack kept several car lengths behind it, maintaining just enough distance to avoid suspicion. The sun had dipped lower toward the mountain ridge, turning the sky into a wash of warm gold mixed with cooling shades of lavender. The temperature began to drop with the coming evening, and a thin veil of dust trailed behind the delivery truck as it rumbled forward. Jack leaned slightly closer to the steering wheel, his jaw tightening. He wasn't a police officer, and he had no authority to stop the vehicle. But the desperate look in the eyes of the two children he'd glimpsed through the rear window had settled deep inside him, like a weight he couldn't shake off. Ranger paced anxiously in the front seat, his powerful muscles tightening with every tiny shift of the truck ahead. The German Shepherd's amber eyes flicked between Jack and the vehicle they were following. Ranger was trained to sense distress, danger, fear, and he felt all three radiating from that battered truck. The dog let out a low whine, pressing his nose briefly against Jack's arm. Jack reached over and brushed his hand against Ranger's head, feeling the warmth of the dog's fur under his palm. "We'll stay with them," Jack said quietly. "As long as it takes." The phone buzzed against the console, still connected from his earlier emergency call. The dispatcher, a woman named Karen Doyle, spoke again. Her voice carried a steady professionalism, but Jack could hear exhaustion beneath it. Perhaps the result of decades working in a small Montana county where emergencies often came from remote stretches of land. He imagined her as a woman in her early 50s, with light brown hair streaked with silver, tied into a loose bun behind her headset. She likely had soft features, the kind shaped by years of offering reassurance to frightened callers, and eyes that reflected both weariness and compassion. "Sir, we've notified Highway Patrol," she said. "They're dispatching units, but the closest one is at least 10 minutes away." Jack nodded, even though she could not see him. "I understand. I'll keep them in sight." "Do not engage," Karen reminded him gently, her tone carrying genuine concern. "Just observe until help arrives." "I'll be careful," Jack replied, and he ended the call quietly. Ahead of him, the old delivery truck suddenly jerked to the right, turning off the main road and onto a narrow dirt path that cut between tall lodgepole pines. The move startled Jack. The truck's driver didn't hesitate. He turned sharply, as if he had always intended to leave the highway at that exact point. Dust billowed up in a thick cloud, momentarily obscuring the truck from view. When it cleared, Jack saw the vehicle bouncing heavily over the uneven dirt trail. "This isn't good," Jack muttered. Ranger responded with a sharp, urgent bark. Jack slowed briefly at the mouth of the dirt road, scanning the area. The mountains loomed taller here, and the shadows between the trees thickened quickly as daylight faded. Nothing about the truck's sudden turn felt casual. It felt deliberate. Too deliberate. Jack's instincts prickled. He had followed enough dangerous trails in his life to recognize when someone was trying to disappear. He guided his truck slowly onto the dirt path, careful not to close the distance too much. The road was rougher than he expected, littered with rocks, roots, and deep tire grooves carved by countless seasons of hunters and forestry vehicles. His tires crunched softly over the hardened earth. Ranger leaned forward, nose twitching at the scents carried on the breeze. Pine sap, distant smoke, and something else he couldn't yet identify. Jack's thoughts drifted back to the children. The fear in their eyes wasn't the kind that came from being lost or picked up by mistake. It was the deep, shaking fear of children who knew they were in danger. Jack felt his chest tighten. During his last deployment years ago, he had failed to save a boy caught beneath rubble after an explosion, a memory that had never fully left him. He could still recall the boy's small hand covered in dust. That memory pushed him now, driving him forward with purpose stronger than fear. When the dirt trail narrowed further, the truck ahead slowed, then disappeared around a bend. Jack eased off the accelerator, letting his own vehicle crawl forward until he reached the curve. There, through the thinning trees, he saw the truck stop near a cluster of old pine stumps. A small clearing opened ahead, a place hidden enough that someone could load or unload cargo without being seen from the road. Jack felt his pulse deepen. The driver stepped out. The man was tall and broad, with a hunched posture that spoke of years of physical labor or habitual caution. His clothes, an old flannel shirt and oil-stained jeans, hung loosely on his frame. His hair was short, uneven, possibly cut by himself, and his beard patchy and unkempt. His movements were sharp and impatient, like someone constantly looking over his shoulder. Whatever had shaped this man's temperament, it wasn't kindness. Jack ducked lower behind his steering wheel. Ranger crouched beside him, ears pinned, staring intensely. The man turned toward the back of the truck. Jack braced himself. If those children came out of that truck, he needed to be ready, not to confront, but to act, because now he knew for certain. This wasn't a wrong turn. This was a transfer, and they were running out of time. Jack eased his truck to a stop behind a cluster of tall pines, letting the deep shadows swallow the vehicle. The forest ahead was quiet, except for the soft whisper of wind weaving through layers of needles and branches. The air grew cooler under the canopy, carrying the scent of resin and damp earth. Jack stepped out silently, closing the door without a click. Ranger hopped down beside him, landing with the soft, controlled grace of a well-trained German shepherd. The dog lowered his head, ears turning like finely tuned instruments as he caught the movement ahead. Jack crouched, blending himself behind the trunk of an old pine mottled with gray bark. Through the branches, he saw the back of the brown delivery truck and the tall driver dragging someone, out of the rear. Another man stood beside him. This second stranger was shorter but thick-set, built like someone who had spent his life hauling lumber or working in harsh conditions. His arms were heavily tattooed with faded ink, his hands scarred, and his neck sunburned under a messy dark beard. His hair was short and uneven, perhaps cut with a dull blade. His posture screamed impatience, shifting from foot to foot as though he wanted the task over with quickly. This man, unlike the first one who radiated nervous energy, carried a cold indifference, as if pulling frightened children out of a truck was just another chore in his day. Jack's pulse tightened as he watched the two men tug the children forward. The older boy stumbled on a rock, catching himself with trembling legs. The younger girl tried to cling to him, tears streaking through the dirt on her cheeks. She was small, slight, and her sandy blonde hair fell in messy strands around her pale face. She looked exhausted, frightened, but still clinging to her brother's arm for comfort. The boy, in his torn yellow shirt, tried to position himself in front of her, as though he could shield her from whatever was coming next. Even in fear, his protective instinct was clear. The men dragged the children toward an old cabin a short distance from the clearing. The cabin leaned slightly to one side as if years of harsh winters had beaten its frame. The wood was weathered silver, patched in places where someone had nailed boards across holes. A single smoke-stained window sat crookedly under a sagging roof. Jack scanned the area, making mental notes. Only one entrance visible from the front. No movement inside. No additional vehicles. At least 2 captors, possibly more. He whispered, "Not yet, Ranger." Ranger pressed closer to the ground, his tail still but his eyes bright and alert. The dog's body was rigid with readiness, every muscle poised. Jack knew Ranger wanted to act, but they needed restraint. They were outnumbered and unarmed. Jack watched as one of the men, the tall, nervous one, pulled a pack of cigarettes from his pocket. He struck a match against the cabin wall, the flame lighting his gaunt face, stepped away from the cabin door, leaving his partner inside with the children. The tall man leaned back against a tree, inhaling deeply, his shoulders slumping a little as the nicotine hit his system. His expression softened into momentary relief, revealing a man who was not hardened by cruelty, but perhaps cornered by desperation. His uneven beard and hollow eyes suggested someone who had lived hard, maybe someone who had lost a job or a family, someone whose life had veered into dark corners he hadn't intended. It didn't justify anything, but Jack saw a man whose fear made him dangerous. Jack touched Ranger's shoulder gently. Now. They moved like shadows, staying low behind bushes and fallen logs until they reached the back of the cabin. The rear wall was even more deteriorated than Jack expected. Several planks were soft and splintered, and a crooked door hung on rusted hinges. With careful pressure, Jack pushed against it. Ranger braced his front paws against the lower edge, and together, with controlled strength, they shifted the door just enough for a quiet entry. The hinges groaned faintly, but not enough to alert anyone outside. Jack stepped inside first. The room was dim, lit only by a patch of fading daylight leaking through a gap in the roof. Dust floated in the air like fragile motes. The children sat on the floor near a wooden crate, their wrists loosely tied with old rope. The boy looked up first, eyes wide, breathing fast. The girl clutched his shirt tightly, her small shoulders shaking. Jack put a finger to his lips, signaling silence. Ranger moved beside him, lowering his head gently, his posture calm but protective. The girl's eyes brightened with a glimmer of hope. The boy swallowed hard, nodding slowly in understanding. Jack crouched and whispered, "I'm here to help. Stay quiet." Before he could untie them, a heavy boot thudded on the cabin floor from the next room. The second man was moving. Jack froze, listening. The footsteps paused just beyond the threshold. A moment of silence stretched thin like wire. Jack gently placed his hand on Ranger's back. Ranger's muscles tightened. Another footstep approached. Whatever happened next, Jack would have only seconds to protect the children. And in that dim cabin deep in the Montana woods, the line between danger and rescue had narrowed to a breath. The footsteps on the wooden floor grew heavier, each step creaking across the warped boards of the cabin as the second man approached the back room. Jack moved instinctively, shifting his weight just enough to block the children from view. Ranger crouched low, his body tensing but his eyes calm, awaiting Jack's signal. When the man stepped into the doorway, his surprise was immediate. A sharp widening of his dark eyes, followed by a quick jerk of his tattooed arms. But Jack, driven by years of training and the instinct to de-escalate, stepped forward and caught the man's wrist, turning his momentum away rather than against him. It was not a violent motion, but a controlled redirection. The man stumbled sideways, hitting the wall with a grunt, more astonished than injured. He recovered quickly and swung again, but Jack's movements were steady and deliberate. He grabbed the man's forearm, rotated it downward, and pressed just enough to immobilize him without causing real harm. The man was strong, short but muscular, with the thick-set build of someone who had labored outdoors for years. His breath was hot and ragged, his beard coarse and flecked with dust, and anger simmered beneath his expression. But beneath that anger was something else. Fear. Jack had seen it before, in men who made terrible choices because life had cornered them. It didn't excuse anything, but it made Jack approach him not as an enemy, but as someone who needed to be stopped without being broken. Ranger moved forward, placing one heavy paw on the man's thigh and lowering his head in warning. He didn't bite or snarl. He simply held the man down with the natural authority of a trained working dog. The man froze instantly, breathing hard, recognizing the discipline in the animal's stare. Ranger's ears flicked back for a moment as he glanced at Jack, waiting for further instruction. "Stay still," Jack whispered. His voice was firm but not harsh. The man swallowed and nodded slightly, his chest rising and falling with the pace of someone whose adrenaline was collapsing into resignation. The taller driver, hearing the scuffle, rushed to the doorway. He looked startled, his gaunt face paling as he saw Ranger pinning his partner and Jack standing over him. This man, the one who had earlier stepped out to smoke, held his hands up instinctively. His lanky limbs trembled, and the hollowed shape of his cheeks suggested long-term stress or struggle. Jack kept his tone controlled. "No one needs to get hurt. Just step back." The taller man hesitated, then slowly obeyed, backing away with hands raised. His expression wavered between fear and guilt, as though even he didn't fully understand how deeply he had become entangled in what was happening. Jack released his grip slightly, letting the pinned man breathe easier. "I'm not here to fight," Jack said. "I just want the kids safe." The shorter man let out a strained breath and nodded once. Seeing the tension ease, Ranger lifted his paw, but remained standing over the man, maintaining gentle pressure with his presence alone. The children watched silently from the corner, their small bodies trembling. The boy tightened his hold on his sister, but the faint spark of hope in their eyes grew as they observed Ranger's calm authority and Jack's steady control. Jack approached the children and knelt. He reached for the rope binding their wrists, loosening the worn knots. "It's all right," he murmured. "You're safe now." The boy, his dark hair falling over tired, wide hazel eyes, opened his mouth as though wanting to speak, but fear clogged his throat. Jack gave him a reassuring nod. "Take your time." The little girl, her cheeks streaked with dried tears, clutched Ranger's fur timidly. Ranger responded with a gentle nudge of his nose, his warm breath settling her shaking hands. Moments passed before the boy finally spoke. "There are more kids." His voice cracked on the last word. "Not here. Somewhere else." Jack felt the weight of that statement anchor in his chest. "Where?" The boy shook his head. "They didn't tell us. They just said we were being moved. Again." He swallowed hard. Different vans, different people, different places. The girl's voice was barely a whisper. "They said someone was coming to get us tonight." Jack's jaw tightened. The forest outside seemed to grow quieter, the whistle of the wind fading beneath the gravity of the children's words. He felt a sting of familiarity, of helplessness he had known too well during combat, watching innocent lives displaced by forces far beyond their control. But this time, he wasn't bound by orders or distance. He was here. He could act. He placed a hand gently on the boy's shoulder. "You're safe now, and I promise, we'll help the others." The tall man in the doorway lowered his gaze, shame flickering across his features. His voice trembled when he spoke. "I didn't want. It wasn't supposed to be like this." His sunken eyes darted to the children. "They told us just to deliver, nothing else." Jack didn't answer. The man's regret, genuine or not, wasn't the priority now. The priority was the children and the others still out there. He turned to Ranger. The dog met his gaze, amber eyes steady, as if already understanding the next step. Jack drew a long breath. We need to get these kids out of here. Ranger moved closer to the children, positioning himself protectively between them and the men. Outside, the wind rustled through the pines, carrying a faint, ominous chill, as though the forest itself sensed a larger darkness waiting beyond the cabin walls. And Jack, standing in that dim room with 2 frightened children and 2 broken men, knew this was only the beginning of something much bigger. The distant wail of sirens drifted through the trees long before the patrol vehicles came into view, their lights flickering like fireflies between the branches. Jack stepped outside the cabin first, signaling to the responding officers with one steady hand while keeping the children behind him. Ranger remained close to the siblings, his protective stance firm yet gentle, his thick sable coat dusted with pine needles and soft dirt from the forest floor. The children clung to him with a trust that came as naturally as breath. 2 sheriff's SUVs finally pulled into the clearing, crunching over gravel and fallen twigs. The first officer to step out was Deputy Mark Hollins, a man in his mid-40s with a broad chest, a prominent square jaw, and a neatly trimmed mustache peppered with gray. His uniform was crisp despite the long drive, and his eyes, steel gray and sharp, carried the cold focus of someone who had seen far too many rural tragedies in his 15 years as a deputy. Mark was known for being calm under pressure, though grief from losing his younger brother to an unsolved missing person case had hardened him. That loss often reflected in the way he approached anything involving children, with a mix of urgency and silent sorrow. He approached Jack with a slow nod. "Heard part of what happened over the radio," he said. "You did the right thing staying with them." Behind him, a younger officer exited the second SUV. This was Officer Denise Parker, in her late 20s. With short auburn hair tucked neatly under her cap and freckles scattered across her fair cheeks. Her posture was sharp, her movements quick. She carried the energy of someone new to the force, but determined to prove herself. Denise had a softness, though, one shaped by growing up with 3 younger siblings and spending her teenage years volunteering at animal shelters. Her eyes warmed instantly when they landed on Ranger and the 2 frightened children. "They're okay?" she breathed. Jack nodded with quiet affirmation. As officers moved to secure the 2 men from the cabin, now handcuffed and seated on the ground, the children shuffled closer to Ranger. The little girl wrapped her small arms around the dog's thick neck, her cheek pressed against his fur. Her voice trembled but carried sincere affection. "You're our angel," she whispered. Ranger's ears tilted toward her, and he gave a soft, gentle chuff as if acknowledging her words. The boy, though older and trying to appear brave, blinked back tears. When Jack knelt beside him, the boy's shoulders trembled. Jack rested a steady hand on him. "You were brave," Jack said softly. "Both of you were. I couldn't leave you out here, and I won't leave the others either." The boy hesitated, looking into Jack's deep blue eyes as though searching for certainty. It was clear he needed that promise, needed to believe that someone stronger, kinder, and capable was finally on his side. Jack gave a firm nod, the kind that came not from duty, but from the core of who he was. "I promise," he said, "not just to you, but to every child still waiting." Officer Denise approached with blankets and gently draped them over the children's shoulders. "You're safe now," she reassured them gently, her voice warm like a summer breeze after a storm. She crouched down to meet their eyes, offering a small smile that softened the tension in their tiny faces. Her presence, though new to them, carried a kindness that helped them breathe easier. Deputy Hollins walked over to Jack, glancing toward the forest before speaking. "We'll take it from here," he said. "But you heard the kids. This isn't the end of it." His tone held both gratitude and concern. The weight of the situation pressed heavily between them. Jack nodded. "I know." "And you're planning to go deeper," Mark guessed, noticing the resolute set of Jack's jaw. Jack didn't deny it. Ranger shifted beside him, sitting tall, ears alert, gaze fixed on the distant tree line. The evening wind brushed through his coat, lifting the fur around his shoulders like a mantle. To anyone watching, it was clear the dog wasn't done, not even close. The officers loaded the two captured men into separate vehicles. The tall, gaunt driver avoided Jack's stare, while the shorter, muscular man lowered his gaze, the guilt settling heavily on his features. Their story, their reasons, their network, it would all come later. Tonight, only one thing mattered. The children were safe. As officers prepared to escort the kids to the SUV, the little girl hesitated. She looked back at Ranger, her tiny fingers clutching the blanket around her shoulders. Jack crouched beside her again. "You'll see him again," he assured. She nodded slowly, then reached forward to give Ranger one last hug. Ranger leaned into it, his warm breath brushing her cheek, offering silent comfort. When the children were finally inside the patrol car, Jack stepped back, watching the taillights glow as the SUV rolled down the dirt path. For a moment, the forest around him fell eerily still. Ranger moved to stand beside him, pressing his head gently against Jack's hip. Jack rested a hand on the dog's back. "We're not done," he murmured. Together, they turned toward the deepening woods. The sky above them shifted into hues of quiet blue and rose, the wind sighing through the pines as if acknowledging their resolve. The forest ahead looked vast, shadowed, filled with secrets, but there was a quiet promise in the air, the kind carried by men and dogs who refused to walk away from those who still needed saving. Jack inhaled the cool evening air, letting it settle into his lungs like a vow. Then he stepped forward, and Ranger stepped with him. Sometimes, in the darkest corners of this world, light appears in the most unexpected ways. A stranger on a lonely road, a loyal dog who refuses to turn away, two frightened children who still dare to hope. These moments, small, quiet, and deeply human, remind us that miracles don't always come with thunder or fire. Sometimes they arrive softly, like a whisper from God. And maybe this is one of those whispers, a reminder that compassion still exists, that courage can bloom even in ordinary hearts, and that God places the right people in the right moment, not by accident, but by purpose. In our everyday lives, we may never find ourselves in a forest, saving lost children. But we do find ourselves standing before choices, big and small, choices that can change someone's day, someone's path, even someone's life. A kind word, a gentle gesture, a moment of empathy. These too are miracles, and each one of us has the power to deliver them. If this story touched your heart today, I invite you to help its message reach even more people. Share this video with someone who believes in the goodness still left in the world. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing your stories. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapter of hope, courage, and God's quiet miracles. May God bless you, protect your family, and guide your steps wherever you go. And may we all, like Jack and Ranger, be willing to answer the call when someone needs us.